Story 1. I developed a hernia after overeating at a company lunch. My belly button went from an innie to an outie. I put off going to the doctor for a few weeks before seeing a specialist. The hernia doctor confirmed it was a hernia and, because of the pandemic, said they could schedule me at any time and there should be no problem if I wanted to wait. I decided to get it fixed. They had a cancellation, so I scheduled the surgery for a week later. I woke up from surgery and the doctor told me there had been a complication. They did not get to the hernia. During the operation, they noticed my appendix was about to rupture, so they removed it instead. I asked when they could fix the hernia. The doctor said the appendix looked unusual and they would send it to the lab and get back to me. The lab was backed up because of the pandemic, so several weeks later I got a call from the doctor. The appendix had a very rare cancer that affects about 1,000 Americans a year. There are two types based on lab work, and I had the worst of the two. The type that spreads quickly and can greatly shorten lifespan even with treatment. The first type grows slowly and stays localized, but occasionally it will differentiate, breach the abdominal wall, and release mucin that can seed more tumors. The cutoff for it becoming the aggressive type is a tumor size of 1 centimeter. Mine was 1.5 centimeters. Under the microscope, it had differentiated and the cells that produce mucin had formed. There is essentially one treatment, referred to as the mother of all surgeries, which is itself like a ball of tactical nukes. I stewed about that for a few weeks while they scheduled more tests. Because of the pandemic, it took a while. I went in for many scans and examinations. The scans were mostly clean with no clear signs of spread. It had just changed from the slow-growing, localized form into the fast-moving form and had not yet released mucin outside the appendiceal wall. If I had waited just one more week for the hernia surgery, each additional day would have exponentially increased the odds of mucin spreading. They believe they removed it all when they removed the appendix. There are a few areas they want to monitor that are likely just scarring from the surgery. They gave me an 80% chance of being cancer-free. I had more scans scheduled for December to confirm. Update December 30th. My December scans came back great. The area they were watching got smaller, not larger, which is what they would expect if it was scar tissue rather than a tumor. I am not completely out of the woods. They will continue routine scans for the next 5 to 6 years, but future scans are expected to improve my prognosis. I will have the hernia surgery in 3 months. My oncologist will be present to examine anything the surgeon finds. Story 2. After a night of partying, a bunch of us wanted to go watch the sun come up at a local beach after we had just graduated high school. There was not a sober one among us, and one guy volunteered to drive his minivan. A few of us said no and suggested we watch from the deck, but he said he was sober enough. I had a bad feeling, and several of us stayed back and slept it off at the house. A few hours later, around 8 in the morning, we were woken by ringing phones, the police, and frantic parents. This was before cell phones. They were in a terrible single-car rollover accident. 4 of the 6 died. No one was wearing seatbelts. They must have taken a curve at about 160 kilometers per hour. That was a rough summer. Survivors' guilt and depression are real. Story 3. My wife dragged my ass to the dermatologist for a cyst I have had for years. While there, the doctor noticed a mole on my ankle that he did not like. Turned out to be melanoma. I would never have gone if my wife had not forced me. Story 4. This is a throwaway. I posted this on the subreddit Creepy Encounters before, using a different throwaway I have since forgotten the password for, if it sounds familiar. Around the time I turned 30 in 2010, I lost a large amount of weight. While I had previously always looked my age or older, I suddenly looked about 5 to 10 years younger than I actually was. I started hanging out in Allston, an area of Boston known for its nightlife, often with people in their early to mid-20s. There was a guy who also hung out down there who really stood out. I never saw him in the bars, just walking down Brighton Avenue or North Beacon Street, usually carrying a gym bag, always alone. Unlike most understated Bostonians, he dressed in a very Eurotrash sort of way. He had a light olive complexion with smooth skin and dark hair, which he wore slicked back. What I remember most vividly is that every time I saw him, he was wearing reflective aviator sunglasses, so I never got a look at his eyes. I thought of him as Aviator Dude. Enjoying my new confidence, I decided to try to befriend him. The first few times I tried to make eye contact, I got exactly zero response. No acknowledgement whatsoever. I suspected he was unfriendly and not interested, but maybe he just did not see me. I was not done trying yet. Finally, one day in early autumn 2010, Aviator Dude and I stood across the street from each other, waiting for the light to change so we could each cross. I decided that this was my chance. As the light changed to the walk signal, I made direct eye contact with him. I gave him a flirty smile and then I winked at him. I immediately regretted this decision. Aviator Dude stopped dead in his tracks. His jaw dropped a little, then his lips hardened into a sneer. I did not need to see past the aviators to know that his face had twisted with disgust. Rather taken aback, I kept walking past him. I looked back briefly. Aviator Dude was still standing there in the middle of the intersection of North Beacon and Cambridge Streets, staring at me with a disgusted look on his face. He shook his head, wrung his hands, and walked on, muttering under his breath. Well, okay then. About 5 years later, I saw Aviator Dude again, but not in person. In 2015, I was watching the trial of the Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev online via Twitter as the news updated in real time. Some of the evidence presented included photographs of Tamerlan Tsarnaev, the older brother who was killed in a shootout with police. I immediately recognized him. Tamerlan Tsarnaev was Aviator Dude. Not only was he a radicalized murderer responsible for the worst terrorist attack in Massachusetts history, but one of the points repeatedly raised by the surviving marathon bombing suspects' defense lawyers was that Tamerlan had been abusive to those weaker than him, especially the women in his life. A domestic violence charge involving an ex-girlfriend delayed his United States citizenship application, and his widow's college friends testified that they heard him being verbally abusive and throwing furniture at her. It has been speculated that the man may also have been responsible for a triple homicide in suburban Waltham in September 2011, about a year after the events described above. I am really glad he rejected me. Story 5. When I was driving in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan last summer, a truck loaded with logs flipped and barreled straight into my car. It completely demolished the vehicle. The doors were pinned shut by the logs and someone had to open a door for me. I walked away without a scratch. Story 6. I manage several acres of woodland with a chainsaw to maintain a desirable mix of tree species and prevent overcrowding. Often, when I cut through the trunk of a tree that is too close to others, it leans against them instead of falling. I then make a series of angled cuts and let sections of the trunk slide more or less vertically to the ground. Eventually, the trunk is vertical enough that I can push it toward a clear space and complete the felling. A couple of years ago, I reached that point. The tree was basically vertical, a few thousand pounds of wood balanced on its end, about 30 feet high. I made another cut, and the rest of the trunk slid down off the 3 feet or so I had separated at the base. Then it began to lean and came down in an unplanned direction. I had left a pile of branches at my feet and found that my legs would not move. I was rooted to the spot, very close to the falling tree. It nicked my head as it passed. A few more inches and it would have done much more damage. Now I am always careful to clear the ground of branches before I do this. Story 7. I was engaged to someone, but I came to my senses and broke it off. 9 months later, I found out she had married someone else, and about 1 year later she killed her husband. Story 8. At 24 years old, I had a sore on my tongue that was bothering me. My boyfriend's father was a dentist, and when I was at their house, I asked him to look. He recommended I see an oral surgeon the next day. The sore seemed to be improving, so I tried to cancel the appointment, but my boyfriend's father insisted I go. The oral surgeon diagnosed it as cancer. It was aggressive, and by the time I had surgery to remove the tumor, it had already spread to multiple lymph nodes. They removed more than half of my tongue, and I underwent chemotherapy and radiation therapy. Given how aggressive the cancer was, I often think that if I had delayed the doctor's visit any longer, I probably would not have survived. I am approaching my 10-year anniversary in January. Story 9. I was driving home from visiting my brother in Vermont when a snowstorm started. I did not have much experience driving in serious snow and I lost control. The car careened off the road, and I was heading for a giant boulder at about 50 to 60 miles per hour. I felt time slow down, reflected on my life for a moment, and said goodbye to my body. Suddenly, an abrupt impact jolted me back, but the boulder was still 20 to 30 feet away. When I got out of the car, I saw that I had hit a small, skinny tree I could have easily grabbed with one hand. However, its large root system lifted the car off the ground and stopped it. The car was totaled, but I was unharmed because of that tree. There is no way I would have survived the other impact. Story 10. Yesterday I was driving, waiting for the left turn arrow to turn green. I spaced out for a moment, then realized the arrow had turned green about a second earlier and took my foot off the brake. As soon as I did, a huge pickup truck ran the red light on my left and did not even touch the brakes. If I had not zoned out, the truck would have hit my door where I was sitting, and I probably would not be typing this now. Story 11. I was walking to work in the winter. Halfway through a step under a skybridge, an icicle taller than me, 6 feet high and about 2 feet in circumference at the base, crashed down right in front of my nose. If the bus had been half a second earlier, or if I had walked even a tiny bit faster, I would have been impaled from my brain to my testicles. I stood frozen for a minute, quietly surveying my near-death experience. Another pedestrian nearby witnessed it. The wide-eyed, ashen look on his face confirmed how narrowly fortunate I had been that day. Story 12. I was on a road trip in college with 4 friends. We stopped halfway because I had severe diarrhea and was getting sicker by the minute. The friends continued to Las Vegas and left me with one of the men who had rented the car to drive me home. The friends who continued were in a rollover accident. 1 died, and 2 sustained life-changing injuries. Story 13. My wife and I were prepared to buy a nice riverfront property in 2019, but the owners, her father and uncle, were dragging their feet. We had the down payment, had been approved for a mortgage, and had even been living there and paying rent. Then the river rose 30 feet or 10 meters and we had to evacuate. The water kept rising, and the house was destroyed before we bought it. So we did not buy it. Story 14. This happened before cell phones existed. I had a long commute home, and on a rare occasion my husband drove into the city to meet me. I left about 15 minutes before him. On the stretch of Highway 101 I needed to take for about 20 miles, a big rig in front of me seemed to be driving erratically. I had a strange feeling, moved into the next lane, and accelerated past it. In my rearview mirror I saw the big rig run over the car in front of it, flip onto its side, and crush the cars in the next lane where I had just been. My husband was behind the accident, and as the police let cars file past in single file, he saw one of the crushed cars had a red bumper. He got home a couple of hours after me and said he had never been so happy to see my red car in the driveway. He had been holding his breath as he turned down our street because he really expected me to be under the big rig. Story 15. Was chatting with a woman at the bar. Nothing flirtatious, just casual banter. I told her I needed to head out and she asked if I could give her a ride. I was headed that way, so it wasn't a big deal. We pulled into her driveway, and I could see a man at a computer in the living room through the window. I asked who it was and she replied, "That's my husband. He's a pansy. I'll bring him outside and you scare him off. Then we can have the house all to ourselves for the night." Every alarm bell in my head was ringing. I wondered how to get this crazy out of my truck without a big scene. So I said, "Sounds good." As soon as she was halfway to the door, I put it in gear and burned rubber. Story 16. I had chest pains one night and woke my wife to tell her. She was frightened it might be a heart attack, and we agreed I should go to the emergency room. The nurses thought it might be a false alarm but ran an electrocardiogram as is common practice. In my head I was hoping the pain would return, not to confirm a heart attack but so we could find its cause. The electrocardiogram was performed by a veteran nurse and a new nurse while I watched over their shoulders. Something flashed on the monitor that made both nurses look at each other in disbelief. They ran it again. One nurse went to the station for help while the other stayed and calmly told my wife and daughter to wait in the waiting room. A few seconds later 5 or 6 more people entered the room and began preparing me for a procedure. It turned out I was having my second heart attack that night in the emergency room. The doctors and nurses found an obstruction in an artery and prepared to clear it and place a stent. When I came out of the procedure, the doctor who placed the stent told me I had probably picked the best time and place to have a heart attack. Right there in the emergency room. Thank you to everyone for the upvotes and awards. This taught me not to take my health for granted and to get checked if I am not feeling well. One detail I appreciated. When placing a stent, the team can access the artery through the wrist or the groin. The male emergency room nurse prepared the groin area in case the wrist access was not viable. Fortunately, the wrist entry was successful. Story 17. Uncle Sam wanted to draft me during the Vietnam War. At the last minute during the physical, I pointed to the surgical scar on my shoulder and said to the doctor, "I don't really trust this shoulder. Any problem?" They took x-rays, and after a short wait, the colonel in charge said, "I'm sorry, son, but I'm going to have to disqualify you." I went home a free man. Leaving a campus tavern on a sunny summer afternoon, my friend and I walked barefoot on the warm rails of the train tracks. We commented that if a train were to come, we would feel it in the rails the same way the original inhabitants could put an ear to the rails and hear a train coming from miles away. Not 2 seconds after that comment, the train horn sounded behind us. It was coming at about 20 to 25 miles per hour, and we jumped off with only a few feet to spare. We were glad the engineer happened to be looking. Story 18. My father-in-law was working on the construction of a power plant and was scheduled to work on Sunday. He was a union pipe fitter. On Saturday, he received a call from another company asking him to run a job much closer to his home, about a 5-minute commute instead of 50 minutes. He accepted and did not go to the power plant job on Sunday. That day, there was an explosion at the plant, and people in the crew he had been working with were killed. To confirm, this was the plant in Middletown, Connecticut. This was a significant event in the state of Connecticut and made national news. I am sure my father-in-law was not the only one who did not go in that day, as it was also Super Bowl Sunday. Story 19. A few years ago, I was in a minor fender bender. Someone merged into my lane while I was in it and smashed my driver's side door into their passenger door. I had pulled my arm in after having it hanging out the window about 15 seconds earlier. I would most likely have had my arm ripped off. Story 20. We were in Italy on a school field trip. We decided to play a game called Schweinhofen, a pig pile or dog pile. One person was declared the pig and everyone had to jump on them. We played on a beach at night. Just sand, no danger. On the last round, we got up and realized we had formed the pile next to a 1-meter metal pole sticking out of the ground. It was maybe 10 centimeters away and could have easily impaled the first 3 or 4 people. We did not play that game again. Story 21. Almost ended up on the Interstate 35W bridge when it collapsed in Minneapolis years ago. My uncle, cousin, and I were on our way to a Minnesota Twins game. We had originally planned to take the route that crossed the bridge, but at the last minute we chose a more scenic route. After it happened, we realized we would probably have been on the bridge within a couple of minutes of the collapse. Story 22. Yesterday I was helping my fiance's dad cut some tree limbs from his yard. He was on a lift trying to cut limbs that were dangling dangerously high over a steel propane tank. The tank contained $1,500 worth of propane. He cut off a limb and it hit the tank with the largest bang I have ever heard. Propane came pouring out the top like smoke from a mortar. He struggled to get the lift down enough to jump out and run for his life. We later found out the limb hit the gas valve and it fell straight down into the tank. If it had sparked once, it would not have mattered how far we ran. We would have been dead, him, me, and my fiancé, who was showering inside and unaware. Now he has no gas and is out $1,500, and he almost died. The big twist is that I saw him smoking up there. There is no way we should be alive, let alone could be. The gas was still leaking more than 24 hours later. Edit. He is getting it taken care of by professionals. We are only careless with power equipment. Story 23. There was an apartment I really wanted, but at the last minute I found a slightly better one. The apartment I almost moved into burned to the ground a month later. Story 24. I just remembered this. It is probably the scariest thing that has ever happened to me. At the time I had no idea and it still scares me today. My dad worked at a church when I was in elementary school. The youth minister seemed fun and had all kinds of things in his office. My brother and I like spending time with him, playing with his Nerf guns and other items he kept for students. We had a tradition. Once a month he would take us to a restaurant for breakfast. My brother and I thought it was great that he paid us attention. We were younger than the students he worked with, but he still made time for us. He had a parish we visited, he had multiple car problems, so sometimes we had to walk, and there were many occasions when we were not in public. A couple of years later, he took another job at a different church and was arrested shortly afterward for child molestation. People came forward about abuse that occurred both before and after his time at our church, but none, as far as I know, from when he was there. So my brother and I were groomed by an experienced molester, and we were clueless at the time. Nothing happened to either of us. We have no idea why, because the opportunity was there. Story 25. I quit a job after my boss yelled at everyone for faking illness when a coworker came in with the flu and spread it around the office. He claimed people do not get sick from being near each other. One coworker became so ill he was hospitalized for 2 weeks. I quit with no backup in October 2019. By February 2020, his company went out of business. Story 26. I met a girl online. We went on one date. She seemed off. 3 months later, she is on Entertainment Tonight for breaking up the marriage of a famous sports reporter and threatening his wife at their home. Story 27. I was moving abroad to do a postgraduate degree. My flight was scheduled to depart Newark early on September 11, 2001. A family friend who worked in the World Trade Center towers kept urging me to move my flight to the afternoon and visit him at his office so he could show me around. My parents were also encouraging me because it would have been a good networking opportunity. I was undecided but decided not to go because I was a poor student and did not want to pay the cab fare from my hotel in New Jersey to Lower Manhattan. Our friend survived, thankfully. I suspect I would have as well, but I would not want that experience burned into my memory. Story 28. My family and I were about to leave a store when my mother needed to use the restroom, so we waited for her. On the highway directly in front of us, a fatal crash killed several people. Story 29. I didn't go to a Halloween party because I had a bad feeling. Years later, I found out 5 girls had been waiting for me to pummel me to the ground. All because I had been friends with one girl's boyfriend, who had admitted he found me attractive. Story 30. I interviewed at a company in New Hampshire that made jams, baking mixes, lollipops, and other confections for a technical job. The president, the owner's daughter, spent most of the interview trashing their current consultant and, of all things, making fun of his degrees. That initially turned me off. Then, speaking with the owner, he took a call and told the person on the other end, "I'll pay you when I pay you. Cash flow issues?" His question about my education was, "What can your fancy degrees do for me?" When I met the vice president of marketing, she asked how many product recalls I had handled. I said none, that was not what I did. She replied, "Wait, what interview is this?" I declined their offer. Fast forward about 5 years. I was talking to a man about some consulting work and the subject of this company came up. He had interviewed there, got the same vibe, and declined. It turned out they were planning to sell the company and were padding its appearance. After the sale, they had spent the preceding months diverting current clients to their next venture. They nearly went to jail for their financial and business misconduct. I would not have been happy to get caught in that mess. Edit. Thank you for the attention. I am just an older guy who has been around, seen some things, and had a few experiences that may serve as cautionary tales. Story 31. When we were buying our first house, everything was ready to sign, but at the last moment the realtor and the company realized the home was in a designated flood zone, 1 in every 100 years or so. The chance was very minimal, but the bank still required flood coverage. The house had been fully renovated, gutted to the studs and redone. I had taken the day off and hired the movers, and at the last minute on a Thursday the seller could not meet and wanted to postpone to Friday. It rained that night and flooded the house, with at least 2 to 3 feet of water inside. While surveying the damage, the seller said he himself would not buy the property even after a cleanup. We got our small deposit back and, about 3 years ago, found the home we live in now. The seller was not aware the property was in a flood zone and therefore had no insurance for it. Story 32. A family friend avoided the Pulse shooting. They had been at a birthday party there, but an intense craving for McNuggets led them to the McDonald's down the road. They left roughly 15 to 20 minutes before the shooting. Story 33. Back in the 1980s, a friend asked me to go on a motorcycle trip to Alaska with him. I declined. He had an accident on the way, skidded several hundred yards on his head, and now has a metal plate. I would have been on that bike with him. Story 34. I really liked my professor and advisor in college. In my senior year, I took a graduate course he offered on the history and technology of nuclear fusion. He was an expert in the field, and the class was an interesting and challenging elective. As a senior in a graduate course, it was unusual to have only 2 or 3 other students. They were all graduate students, and at least 2 worked with the professor at his company. As the year progressed and I tried to decide what to do after graduation, the professor offered me a place in his graduate program and a job at his company. I had recently married, and my wife had already graduated. The place where she worked, where she had been lead technical support for a startup internet service provider, offered her a full-time business analyst position, which was her dream job at the time. After much consternation, we chose a different path and moved away. Within the next couple of years, the startup my wife worked for went out of business in less than a year. The professor was arrested returning from an overseas seminar for sharing classified nuclear information. He served time in prison and his company was closed. One of his employees, a graduate student, pleaded guilty and served time. I believe he was one of the other students in the class. Another employee was identified as a foreign national, arrested, and deported. I believe he was another student from the class. Often in life you make decisions with the best information you have, and you never really know if you made the right one. In this case, I know beyond a doubt that my wife and I made the right decision. Story 35. We went to Thailand in 2003 for Christmas. I had spent several years there in the early 1990s as a child, and we loved it so much that we planned to return the next year to spend Christmas watching the sun rise on a beach in Phuket. We had the tickets, but because of fallout from a scandal related to Enron, my father was not allowed to leave the country. He was not implicated, but he held a senior executive position at a credit card company, and all people in similar positions were under a travel advisory. The hotel where we had planned to stay was completely destroyed by the tsunami, so I suppose we were lucky. Story 36. I used to own a gym with a partner. I sold my half of the company and took a boring but stable government job about 3 months before the pandemic. Story 37. Around 2004, when I was 20 years old, I was on a road trip with my friend and her dog from California to Washington. I was driving north on Interstate 5 at about 1 a.m., using cruise control to keep my speed at 75 miles per hour. The speed limit was 70 miles per hour. I had gotten speeding tickets on that part of Northern California before, so I used cruise control to avoid speeding and tried never to go more than 5 miles per hour over the posted limit. It was pitch black and early morning. My friend's seat was reclined all the way back and she was napping with her dog on her chest. I saw what I assumed were police lights come up behind me. The car pulled alongside and matched my speed exactly. I kept my eyes on the road, but I knew the driver was staring at me. I was not panicking because I believed I was not really speeding. I glanced at the speedometer to reassure myself and may have slowed a notch or two. After what felt like an eternity, the cruiser slowed, moved behind me, and turned on the lights. As I slowed and pulled to the shoulder, I nudged my friend awake and told her I was being pulled over. She asked if I had been speeding and I told her I had not and that I had been using cruise control. I was shaking by this point. Something did not feel right about this stop. The area was deserted. There had been no gas stations or rest areas for miles. The officer walked to the passenger side as my friend used the lever to return her seat to an upright position. When he reached the passenger window, he looked surprised that I had a passenger. He fumbled his words and accused me of going 90 miles per hour. He was so flustered he did not ask for my license until I prompted him. He returned to his car, and my friend and I exchanged a stunned look. Her dog was extremely agitated throughout the interaction. I had never seen that dog act like that before or after. From past experience on that stretch of road, I knew how long a normal stop should take and what to expect. Usually officers returned to their cruisers for 6 to 8 minutes. This officer came back after about 2 minutes, tossed my license and registration into my friend's lap like he was annoyed, told me to slow down, and said he would give me a verbal warning. I thanked him. While I was putting my license and registration away, he started his cruiser and accelerated quickly back onto the highway. That, too, was unusual. Officers I had encountered always asked me to pull out ahead of them so they could ensure I merged safely. My friend and I were shaken. She was more frightened than I was. I initially tried to rationalize the encounter, but the longer I thought about it, the more uncomfortable I became. Years later, I heard about a police officer who had been arrested for trolling Interstate 5 in Northern California during that same general time period, stopping unsuspecting young single female motorists and sexually assaulting them in his cruiser. His modus operandi was to pull up alongside cars, make sure the drivers were young single females, and pull them over in desolate areas at early morning hours. He murdered one woman who resisted. I did not see the officer's face clearly that night, but when I learned about that case, my blood ran cold. I had avoided a potentially catastrophic event because of my tired friend and her protective dog. Edit. I did not expect the large response to this story. Some commenters identified a similar case shown on forensic files from the 1980s in San Diego, but that was a different incident. I did not see the officer's face. I have done some light searching to try to find a news article about this specific case, but have not found one yet. I may have the year wrong. It could have been as early as late 2002 or as late as 2007 or 2008. I am also not certain of the exact location. Interstate 5 in Northern California has many long, dark stretches. If I had to guess, it was somewhere in the area before or after Redding, California. I discovered there are many disturbing stories like this in the news, both old and recent. Pro tip: if you ever find yourself alone on a highway and a police stop makes you feel uncomfortable, slow down, turn on your hazard lights, and call 911 if you can. If you have no service, keep driving until you do. Inform the dispatcher of your situation. They can relay the information to the officer behind you and may arrange to have the officer follow you to a safer, well-lit location. A dispatcher may also be able to confirm whether a marked police unit is actually in that location, in which case you should keep driving and wait for the real police to arrive. Thank you for the unexpected awards and the concern. Stay safe out there. Story 38. In 10th grade of high school, I was in love with a man. Yes, a man, because he was at least 21 years old. He ended up ghosting me and dating my best friend. I was devastated, to say the least. A few months later, my former best friend, who had green eyes and a pretty figure, suddenly started dressing in oversized men's clothing. She stopped participating in sports and stopped going to events. She looked tired and sad all the time. Turned out this man was manipulative, controlling, and unstable. He forbade her from talking or interacting with anyone at school unless absolutely necessary. He got her a cell phone and made her call him between each class so he could be sure she was not talking with friends. He got her pregnant in our senior year and, soon after graduation, moved her to a new town where she did not know anyone, essentially isolating her and further controlling her. I look back on that and think that could easily have been me. I was a sucker in high school and very boy crazy. I know I would have fallen for his trap. Story 39. I almost ended up working for a cold calling rehabilitation center. It seemed sketchy from the start, so I decided against it. Months later, everyone who worked there was arrested for running an insurance fraud scheme. Story 40. When I was 16, a good friend's father, a wealthy businessman in Chicago, got involved with the wrong man's woman. My friend said it had something to do with the mob or a mobster's wife. I never knew for sure, but I saw his father threatened at a tennis court by two well-dressed, clearly Italian men who drove up in a black Cadillac. I was sitting with my friend as they talked to him. It was exactly like the movies. My friend said there was a contract on his father and spoke about it like it was cool. I had been invited on a fishing trip on Lake Michigan that week. My friend, his father, his father's friend, and I, 2 days before the trip. A family emergency took me to Cincinnati. When I returned, my friend's body was found floating in Lake Michigan. He was wearing a life vest. His father, his father's friend, and the boat were never found. The police questioned me, but I said I couldn't describe the men and avoided specifics. The coolest kid I knew, Chris, was dead. They never found his father or the boat. It was a nice boat on a calm day, and something terrible happened. I have always felt I dodged being dragged into something I couldn't have escaped. Story 41. We came up shy of our financial goal for a wedding and decided to save for another year. We were going to go on an adventure and elope. The relationship fell apart the following year. Both of us put nails in the coffin. I was the only one to acknowledge my part. She could do no wrong in her view, and I was being gaslit severely. When we split, my depression evaporated. I was able to go off my medication and realize just how deep she had her claws in me. I thank God every day we didn't get married. My mental health would have been horrendous. Story 42. When my nephew was 9 months old, I brought him to live with me. A week later, someone broke into the house I had taken him from and killed all the dogs inside by slitting their throats. I still break out in a sweat every time I imagine what would have happened if he had been there. Story 43. I was briefly engaged to a man who has since cheated on his wife hundreds of times. They are separated but have 2 children and will likely reconcile. I broke our engagement when he said it was perfectly okay for a man to cheat on his wife if they had been married for a while and he had gotten bored. Oddly enough, he did not believe a woman was entitled to do the same. I feel so bad for his wife. He began cheating on her 2 years into their marriage, when she was pregnant with their first child. Story 44. I met a girl one summer and she fell head over heels for me. She even ditched her fiancé for me, but when she went home at the end of the summer, they got back together and married. I saw her again the following summer and she wanted to pick up where we had left off, but I said no. Years later, I ran into her. She told me all about her sex life and how her husband could no longer satisfy her. So she was hooking up with strangers online while he slept in the spare room. By then, they had 2 children. I felt sorry for them. Edited. Wow. My top comment ever was about some crazy summer fling from years ago. Who would have thought? Story 45. I dated a woman who was physically and emotionally abusive. I got caught in the cycle of abuse and gaslighting and was afraid and unsure how to leave. One day, a neighbor witnessed one of her violent outbursts and called the police. She was arrested and charged with domestic violence and assault. I was granted a restraining order. Fortunately, the dilemma resolved itself. A friend told me that if I had stayed much longer, I would be dead. He was not kidding. Story 46. My manager tried to have me fired for underperformance, and I was so depressed that I believed I was an awful employee. My workplace has an extensive procedure just to issue a verbal warning, let alone to fire someone, so she tried to get me to accept a severance payment to leave and save her the trouble. I had to take sick leave shortly after that conversation, and while I was gone, she initiated the formal process to have me fired. I was able to delay the process for a couple of months, and during that time I discovered she had falsified documents to make me look like a lost cause. Presenting a dossier to Human Resources that demonstrated her statements were provably misleading and documenting every time she failed to follow proper procedures turned everything around. I was moved to a better job on a better team. I spent a year making sure she heard about my successes whenever I received praise from the department head. It was frustrating that she did not get fired, but there would have been too many repercussions for management if she had. Still, I went from the verge of unemployment to unequivocal success. Story 47. I had just moved to Colorado alone, and for some reason my mother was encouraging me to get out of the apartment and go see the new Batman movie. That was the night of the theater shooting, and it was the exact showing I had been considering attending. I stayed up late playing League of Legends and woke up to many text messages and missed calls. Sleeping in late that day probably did not help my family's blood pressure. Story 48. When we were younger, a man we knew slightly, who was extremely charming and debonair, asked my best friend on a date. Everybody liked him and urged her to say yes, but she got a really creepy vibe from him and turned him down. 20 years later, he is all over the news because he has been arrested as a serial killer who approached women, charmed them, took them on dates, and murdered them. He began killing women around the time he asked her out. If she had gone out with him, she would have been one of his first 3 victims. The police even interviewed her as they tried to piece together the early years of his murder spree. Story 49. Well, it was not as bad as the others, but I really wanted to move into a small apartment. It was close to my girlfriend's place and quite large for the price, so it seemed great. However, the landlord did not want a student tenant, only workers. Because we were already in touch with the previous renter, we later found out the landlord began to bully this poor person out of the apartment because he needed it for himself. It started with unfriendly treatment and ended with major renovations that began in his bathroom without warning, so he had no bathroom for 3 months. I moved into another apartment where I still live today. Only a few weeks after I moved, my previous place caught fire and nearly burned down. Story 50. When I was about 16 and still in school, I was at a house party. A friend's older brother and a group of his friends showed up and brought out some cocaine. I had a bad feeling, so I called my mother and left. The party was broken up. Some people ended up with jail time. I missed it by 15 minutes. Story 51. When I was 11, I started losing vision in my left eye and became completely blind in about 2 to 3 weeks. After extensive testing, doctors found a tumor on my left optic nerve that would likely spread quickly. They surgically removed my eye, started me on radiation therapy and chemotherapy, and gave me a year and a half to live in the best-case scenario with treatment. Fortunately, I responded well to treatment. The cancer is gone. I am now a cyclops and happy to be disease-free. Story 52. Back in college, my ex cheated and became pregnant. She blamed me and involved her family. I was prepared to file a case in court and pursue medical legal testing. When I spoke with her father about the medical tests, she became pressured and later admitted I was not the father. The father was a classmate she had a fling with. Story 53. At university, my 2 best friends and I were drinking, playing Mario Kart, and shooting the shit. We were hungry and wanted food. I said, let's just make a tombstone pizza. Because we had been drinking and most delivery services were closed at 1:30 a.m. One friend said he was fine to drive. I said no, that was a bad idea. He convinced the other guy to go with him. McDonald's usually does not take 2 hours, so eventually I went for a scooter ride since McDonald's was less than 2 miles away. I noticed a taped-off spot on the bridge right before McDonald's with a crane, police, and an ambulance. They had pulled the car off the bridge and into the shallow creek. The occupants had died on impact. I escaped physically but suffered survivor's guilt for nearly 5 years. Edit. I was not expecting all the upvotes, awards, and positive feedback. Thank you to everyone who read this and felt something. Life is tough and you never know when it will be someone's time. Have a nice day. Additional details based on comments. 1. I am doing well. Depression and a fear of driving lasted a long time. Moving back home for 2 semesters helped a lot compared to being alone in the college apartment we shared. 2. They were the old Razor kick scooters, not mopeds or electric scooters. 3. I took the driver's keys, but he had a spare key and they left when I went to the bathroom. When I returned to the living room, they were gone. I looked out the window and his car was gone. I said, fuck, what an idiot. His dad is going to be livid if he gets pulled over. Story 54. Incident 1. 4 days ago, we were in a near head-on collision. A car was passing 2 vehicles, including an 18-wheeler, on a 2-lane road at night with a double yellow line and was headed straight for us. My husband was driving and he swerved off the road to avoid the collision. We missed being hit by inches. Thankfully, the other driver did not swerve or he would have hit us, and the shoulder of the road happened to be level where we ended up. I can only imagine how many people would have died if not for my husband's quick reflexes and sheer dumb luck. I am having another panic attack just thinking about it. Incident 2. My husband and I were attending a local trade show, but he had to be there earlier, so we arrived separately. During the show, he said he was not feeling well and went home. I was approached by someone who wanted to talk to me, so I told him I would be a few minutes behind and that I would see him at home. When I got home, he was not there. I called his mobile phone but got no answer. I called his office but he was not there and no one had seen him. I became frantic. About an hour later, I received a call on his mobile phone from a doctor at a clinic between the trade show and our house. We had been to that clinic before. The doctor told me to get to the clinic right away because my husband was there and he would tell me more when I arrived. My husband had started feeling extremely sick on the way home. He pulled over to the side of the road hoping I would see him and stop, and he waited for a few minutes. When I never showed up, he felt like he was going to lose consciousness. He remembered the clinic a couple of blocks away, drove himself there, and stumbled inside. At the clinic, he was in full anaphylactic shock from an allergic reaction to a recently prescribed medication. The staff rushed him back and treated him immediately. The doctor told me that if my husband had not arrived when he did, he most likely would have died in his car on the highway. Fortunately, they administered epinephrine with an auto-injector in time to save his life. At the time this happened, mobile phone use was not widespread. If I had had a mobile phone, which I did not, this probably would not have occurred. After this incident, I got a mobile phone and my husband obtained an epinephrine auto-injector, just in case. Story 55. During university, my former partner asked me to obtain a work visa for her. She proposed and even faked a pregnancy. The mental stress caused me to fail my exams, and I had to take a year off to return home, save money, and come back. I eventually discovered she was cheating on me. Story 56. I had a gut feeling not to make my turn at an intersection. A driver in a Dodge Charger ran a stop sign. I was 7 months pregnant at the time and driving a Subaru Outback. It was not a nuke, but I dodged a Charger. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.